change is worrying in a way that the needs are getting different.
Конечно, очень хочется, чтобы жизнь вернулась в поселок.
Covid-19 pandemisi özellikle dezavantajlı grup olarak adettiğimiz Suriyeli mültecileri de çok derinden sarstı.
Our support is still needed.
Climate change is worrying in a way that the needs are getting different.
Конечно, очень хочется, чтобы жизнь вернулась в поселок.
Covid-19 pandemisi özellikle dezavantajlı grup olarak adettiğimiz Suriyeli mültecileri de çok derinden sarstı.
Our support is still needed.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon. I hope you had a good bite and something to drink and are in full combat gear for what I hope will be the mother of all panels. Because when we're speaking about innovative financing, actually we speak about the future of humanitarian aid. This is not just any discussion that we're going to have. This is about whether given the steeply rising needs for humanitarian aid, we will be able to live up to the challenges in the future. And I'm firmly convinced that if the business model of humanitarian aid does not evolve in the next 10 years, we are going to become totally irrelevant. We will not be able to face the challenges. Finance is a big part of that issue. It's not the only question. And I'm very happy that at this forum here, we are looking into so many innovative approaches, localization, greening, nexus, and so forth, the need for more humanitarian diplomacy. But without money, nothing works. And money, we don't have enough. It's in the nature of money that there's never enough of it. The question is not only to how use the money that we have more efficiently, but also how to get more money into our market. So this is about innovative financing. And it is true that we are facing this increasingly dramatic financing gap. It's a gap not between financing and needs, it's a gap between government financing and needs. Because obviously the humanitarian sector very largely, and despite the donations by private persons like, taxpayers like you and me, everything we give for Christmas or something like that, despite all that, the big money in the humanitarian sector obviously comes still from ministers of finance. And there's not enough of it. You all know the situation. Some governments give more, others give less. But by and large, the amount that worldwide from year to year is mobilized in terms of official development assistance for the humanitarian sector remains almost stable. And even if there are small increases, they are simply outpaced by the needs. And I would say so even without the Ukraine crisis, even without COVID, even without the major dramatic crisis that the humanitarian sector had to face over the past couple of years. So in other words, we need to go beyond government finance, or we need to use government finance in a more intelligent way to trigger, for example, private investment. Now, this has been discussed already for a couple of years. This has been discussed, for example, in the context of the World Economic Forum. It was discussed at the World Humanitarian Summit. And at the end of the day, the question is still, how can we engage private capital as one of the possibilities to address the financing gap, how can we leverage financial and private sector capital for humanitarian outcomes? Or is that a dead-born question from the beginning? Now, probably it's better if we go a little bit more into detail on all this. How is it possible to address risk? How can we attract private capital to be invested in risky environments, in fragile contexts? How can we balance possibly contradictory needs of investors to generate returns over time with the humanitarian imperative to act quickly and address acute needs? And I hope that our discussion today will give us some hints in this direction. We want to discuss among humanitarian organizations, but also development finance institutions, private social investment community members, and others who have something to contribute on this. Now, as DG ECHO, that I have the honor to represent as the Deputy Director General, as DG ECHO, of course, we're working with these organizations. We want to launch, and they're about to launch, some pilot projects, for example, in the area of blended finance, where we would mix ECHO grants with loans that are levied from the private sector. I'm very pleased that today we have here some people who give us insights in what the sector needs, what the sector expects, and what it takes in order to unlock additional financing that might help us to address these financial gap. Therefore, I'm very, very happy to present you the panel who is partly physically present here, but also remotely connected to our discussion. And I'm very happy that we have such a group of very competent people who are going to shed light on this question from a variety of angles. There is, to my left, Ellen Brooks-Shehata. She's the investment lead at the International Rescue Committee. IRC, the International Rescue Committee, have been one of the organizations leading the way in studying how innovative finance models can apply to humanitarian aid. They will be one of the organizations with whom we at ECHO launch pilot projects in blended humanitarian financing even this year. So if the proof of the pudding is in the eating will take place this year, and that makes it concrete. Thank you for making it to our panel here, Ellen. We have online Jean-Bertrand Motte, who is the head of the Division for Fragility, Crisis and Conflicts at AFD, Agence Française de Développement. Of course, one of the major development partners and also a development bank, not only government agency, that from year to year is more confronted with the challenge of working in situations of fragility, also fighting vulnerabilities. And that has become a common goal between the development and the humanitarian community. So very happy that Jean-Bertrand is with us and can share some of his insights on how to get money from the private market, from the private sector into the development sector. Jakob Harbo, sitting here on my right-hand side, is the head of partnerships and compliance at the Danish Red Cross. Danish Red Cross have been one of the most innovative organizations in the humanitarian sector when it comes to financial techniques. Actually, every time a German speaks about Scandinavians, they say they are much more innovative than we are. So we want to change this. But maybe you can change this with your insights and with your account of, for example, the volcano bond, which was the first catastrophe bond to be developed with a humanitarian focus. Of course, we need to hear more about how it works, how happy you are with it, also about the insurance products that the Danish Red Cross has been working with, and your overall context with the insurance industry, actually, that have made you a market leader in this. You have won a number of insurance industry awards in 2021. So if you don't know to talk about this, then I don't know who. And then finally, we have Patrick Elmer. Patrick is the CEO of the social impact investment advisory firm iGravity. iGravity are specialists engaging private impact investment in supporting local enterprises in developing and fragile contexts. And they work together with the Danish Refugee Council, actually, launching, for example, a refugee investment fund this year. This fund, which is a blended financing product, aims at delivering humanitarian outcomes amongst displaced community. We're happy to say that this project will also be supported as a pilot project by DG ECHO. So very concrete solutions. And maybe some of them will even fly, will even work, and can make a contribution not only to channeling more money into the sector, but becoming a game changer in the way how we finance humanitarian needs. But before listening to all these extremely well-informed speakers, I would suggest that we hand the floor to Juan Coderque. Juan is the lead of ICRC's new Financing Model Center of Expertise. A long title, but a very concrete outcome. And he's one of the co-leads of the World Economic Forum's Humanitarian Investment Initiative, the main global forum for leveraging investments in humanitarian contexts. So, Juan, many thanks for making it. Many thanks for being with us. Over to you for a brief scene setter on the challenges and opportunities that we are facing in delivering innovative financing models for humanitarian aid. Please, take the floor.
Just to confirm, can you hear me okay?
Wonderfully. Just go ahead, please.
All right, super. And I'll certainly keep under the 7-minute barrier. So, just before diving into the role of innovative finance as a means to address the humanitarian funding gap, allow me to perhaps also state the obvious. After all, I do come from the ICRC, and is that in order to reduce the funding gap, there's also an urgent need for more prevention and resolution of armed conflict, and for more respect of international humanitarian law in conflict situations. That would, of course, reduce humanitarian needs and therefore reduce the funding gap. Forgive me for if this sounds naive, particularly in the current context, but it has to be said. Now, innovative finance is about, first of all, in our perspective, is about new ways of financing, but even more importantly, about new ways of working. These new ways of working include partnerships across sectors, co-creation, longer-term and outcomes-based approaches, efficiencies, local anchorage. Innovative finance, very importantly, also allows for early engagement with development and private actors, which in turn opens doors to more sustainable approaches to building the resilience of communities ahead of crisis, in protracted settings, in recovery. If I had to name 3 challenges to the growth of innovative finance, I would mention 3. The first is about the comfort zone and organizational readiness. And the point here is that innovative finance takes all actors beyond their comfort zone, testing their systems and processes, their notions of risk, their culture, their capacity to work across sectors, and I would even say sometimes their imagination or our imagination and our capacity to imagine different futures. So stated differently, the organizational readiness of the different players across a series of dimensions is not necessarily up to speed, and it requires investment. So first challenge, again, is about organizational readiness. Second is about the identification of investable business cases in humanitarian operations with measurable impact on populations, in addition to the preservation of capital and a potential return. This requires experimentation, it requires learning. Very importantly, it requires the sharing amongst us, the sharing of those learnings. It requires training, it requires time. And it also requires involving the private sector and development actors early on to identify potential business models and pathways to scale, to avoid just a pilot here and a pilot there. Third, frankly, it's about access to financial support, to financial resources that support these efforts, these explorations in innovative finance. So, globally speaking, field actors find it difficult to mobilize seed funding, early support funding, de-risking capital, and I would challenge all of us in the sense that there seems to be still an important disconnect between wanting to explore innovative finance and actually allocating financial resources to support the build-up of organizational readiness, exploration, early design, de-risking, blending. As one of my team members likes to say, nexus funding doesn't exist, which can be a problem sometimes. So, in order to accelerate progress, there's a need to step out of our comfort zones, to build organizational readiness, to further explore partnership and business models that lead to impact and scale. And yes, more financial support is required. We do need to walk the talk, each of us from different angles and based on our mandates. Now, in order to overcome those three challenges, again, exploring pathways to scale, mobilizing partners and resources, organizational readiness, the ICRC, the WEF and other partners launched the Humanitarian Resilience Investing Initiative in January 2019. We define humanitarian resilience investing as capital invested in ways that measurably benefit people and communities in context of displacement and fertility, conflict and violence, while creating a financial return. Now, ECHO has been a very active member in the Humanitarian Resilience Investing Initiative, and we thank you for it. So, to conclude my introduction, innovative financing is, first of all, about creating new ways of delivering impact, collaborating across sectors, supported by different sorts of financial mechanisms and sources of capital, complementary to the more traditional ways of doing things, of delivering humanitarian action, and actually informing it. Over time, it should indeed, innovative finance should indeed contribute to mobilizing additional and diversified resources, and very importantly, to more sustainable and more relevant humanitarian impact. So I'll stop there and happy to engage in conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan, for setting the scene. Thank you for summarizing the three challenges that you see. The job of all of us here is to create hope. So we want to focus on solutions, and I think solutions are at hand because, as I said, a couple of projects are already running and more pilots are coming online this year. What is the starting point? We're all aware of this huge financing gap that there is. We all used to humanitarian appeals that have, let's say, responded to only by 20, 30, 38% or something like that, for example, in Western Africa. We see that the gap becomes bigger and bigger from year to year. In 2020, the financing gap in the humanitarian sector stood at 17.5 billion euros. This was when the world was still halfway in order. That was before COVID. This was before Ukraine. It was before things turned even more sour in Afghanistan. So the gap would be much, much bigger now. But rather than falling into depression because of that, let's focus on another figure. The other figure is that there are global financial markets, there are assets out there by the dimension of 92.8 trillion euros. So how to kind of channel part of that into the humanitarian sector? By creating business models, by creating interesting investment perspectives. And that is what I would like to have some insights on here from our panelists. There is this pool of capital out there, which perhaps partly we can harness to meet some humanitarian outcomes and address part of the financing gap. What are your views on the potential for that? I would like to ask Jakob first, Sorry for not starting with the ladies this time, but next time we're doing better. And then after Jakob, Jean-Bertrand, Ellen, and Patrick. Jakob, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think from the Danish Red Cross side, we are very aware that this is a potential. And you mentioned in the beginning, this is the future. And for me, that's very clear. If we want to have any chance of closing this gap, we need to go into these kind of mechanisms. And I think maybe one of the quick wins is to start not calling it innovative financing when we talk to the financing sector. Because these products are actually very normal for the financing sector. It's generally just adapting them to the humanitarian system. So I think from our side, I think it's very obvious in the products that we have put out in the market, the investment interest is so high. We have had, as you mentioned, the catastrophe bond we launched last year. We only asked for $4 million of investments. We asked 4 partners because we wanted a wide range of investors to come in. All 4 of them would like to cover the whole cost of it. So we could have got 10 times as much money in our cat bond if we had the possibility of doing. The problem is, how do we scale it? And I think that's where we have the issues, and where we have to focus a little bit is how do we ensure that we have the scalability possibilities? How do we ensure that we have the de-risking possibilities so we make it cheaper to borrow, so we don't need as much, grant funds to make sure that we can pay premium investor. And for us, that is the major capital we need to unlock. How do we do that in a better way? How do we ensure that we have the capital to actually support the investors? Because the investors are there. The ESG, you said these very enormous numbers of children, right? But just ESG funding among the company are more than $80 billion a year. We should be possible to get some of it. We are the humanitarian sector. It should be right up the alley, and it is, and they are very interested. We just need to find how we unlock the potential of the greater scale, because the small scale, as we have done so far, and the pilots are going well, and it's easy to find the capital. We just need the model to scale it.
You already made inroads and given me hope, which I had asked for. Fantastic. Jean-Bertrand, can you add to that space of hope that is opening up?
Yes, I will try. Just can you hear me well? Just checking.
Very well. Très bien.
First, allow me to be quite blunt. This is a real challenge for donors and development actors such as Agence Française de Développement. As has been said by Ron as introduction and scene setting, we don't have yet the organizational mandate, systems, resources to fully leverage private capital in fragile settings. And what just has been said by Jakob was quite true too. We need to find the right scale-up mechanism. But I wanted to, as a way to give you some hope, present you a few tools we have implemented at Agence Française de Développement for the past few years, trying to mobilize the private sector in crisis and conflict zones, particularly through our subsidiary Proparco, which is in charge of private sector financing. One of these tools is called ARIS TPE. It's a portfolio guarantee product adapted to the characteristic of crisis and post-crisis area. It's based on the ground, and it's used to work with more fragile financial institutions that will not be eligible for traditional guarantees due to the risk involved. It is paired with simplified management procedures that allows for the coverage of a very large number of small loans to SMEs and the acceptance of a higher level of risk, roughly 80% loss. We've launched a few pilot projects in Lebanon and Cameroon. It's a very relevant and effective product. It's, however, expensive, and as I just mentioned, it has not yet been scaled up because it's based on grant. The other product we've been testing, the FISEA facility, which was renewed in last year from Tier 1 as part of the Choose Africa program, with the total investment capacity of 200 million and 10% of its facility is earmarked on fragile areas. It supports companies directly or via investment funds. It's the same liability as I mentioned at the beginning. It's based on grants, so we have to find a way to scale up and tap on this broadly. One of the things I wanted to mention also as part of giving you hope is We are following with huge interest the emerging initiative such as the peace bonds that could allow for a more significant reorientation of markets towards fragile areas, as green bonds have turned to finance ecological transition. It could join the family of sustainable bonds such as social bonds that address social issues on peace and fragility's country. And we are particularly following the work of Interpeace, for instance, but we could elaborate on that later.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Bertrand. In your very sophisticated mother tongue, you make a difference between espoir and espérance, and what you gave us is even espérance. Let's continue with Ellen. Even more hope on offer.
No pressure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to DG ECHO for having me here. I think actually the optimism that we have at the IRC comes from really understanding the barriers as to why that capital has not flowed today from capital markets. So by way of background, I used to work in banking, so I was very familiar with those tremendous asset flows, and there's a lot of that capital that is flagged for sustainable and ESG investing. But at the end of the day, there's a strong network barrier between investors on Wall Street and humanitarians. And some of that is rightfully so, and some of that needs to be overcome. And so what I did when I first got to the IRC was to talk to former colleagues on Wall Street. And a lot of them don't truly understand the humanitarian sector, and that's them to blame because they've caused a lot of the problems in things that they've financed over the years. But at the same time, it's a real opportunity for humanitarian agencies to help articulate what is happening and what the needs are so that investors can unlock capital to make investments in more fragile contexts. And so the way we're envisioning that at the IRC is through what we're calling the advisory model, and it's thanks to DG ECHO that we'll be able to continue piloting this project. It's a transformation, or hopeful transformation. We're generating the evidence as we speak, where we're repositioning humanitarian agencies to be advisors to investors, whether private sector investors or development banks, with the intention of driving more capital to more fragile contexts. So the theory of change we're operating with is if humanitarian actors can deliver client-centered advisory, and we call our beneficiaries of our programs clients to enable agency and accountability on our side. So client-centered advisory rooted in localized knowledge to investors who are financing projects in fragile or conflict-affected settings. Then the humanitarian impact of those investments will be better accounted for and be a better outcome. And risks associated with investments in fragile contexts will be better mitigated. And the risks I'm talking about are these perceived risks, which come from a lack of data, a lack of information. And there's a lot of investors who think that there's not a lot of data in fragile contexts. But if you enter a humanitarian agency like I have, you're so impressed by the monitoring and evaluation that humanitarians are doing around their programs. And so it's a question of translating that data that's being collected into data that can be used by investors to make informed investment decisions and better diligence projects. And so we see this partnership that we're working on in the advisory model, which I can speak about later in the talk, but is one opportunity to drive significant amounts of development capital to more fragile contexts. And hopefully it can be replicated by many other development actors, many other private sector investors, and humanitarian agencies as well.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Let's also hear from Patrick. Patrick, if anything, you present here the private sector. And, when you work in the public sector like me, you have this kind of mythological veneration for the private sector, knowing that we are doing the talk, but you in the private sector, you are supposed to do the walk. So how do you walk, actually?
Yes, thank you, Michael. I think, again, the good news is certainly that there is an increased interest from investors, from the finance community towards sustainability, and even more to create tangible impact. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the investor community is not an homogeneous block, but it's a mix of different actors that have different objectives and motivations. And just to simplify, what we usually do, we divide it into the financial community, financial investors, where is most of the money lying around, banks, pension funds, insurance company, wealth managers, and then there are the more philanthropic investors, foundations, NGOs, development agencies, DFIs that still have capital to invest as well. And I think if you look at the financial community, these are pretty logical actors. So when they assess new investment opportunities, as obviously many of you know, there are a couple of criteria they will always look for. And very basic, they will ask for an attractive financial return. And the riskier the investment, the more return they will want to get. Then second, they think, they have a portfolio approach or lens, a portfolio view. So they will try to understand how this investment can fit into their asset allocation. So they have, certain percentage they can invest in fixed income, in private debt, or in private equity, or in emerging market. So it needs to fit with their asset allocation. Then most financial investors, they will want some degree of liquidity. So they want to invest and they want to have the chance to exit at some point, which is probably not in 10 years' time. And then they like to invest in securities, in funds, in bonds, in structures. So if you go to them with a single investment, it's going to be very difficult. And last but not least, they ask for track record. Every investment they look at, even if you face the most excited and motivated person on the financial investor side, they will need to run it through their internal due diligence process, and there will be colleagues asking you, how long have you done this? How big is the product? What is the track record? So these are all boxes that you need to tick. I think that's important to understand. Then obviously when you work with philanthropic investors, again, they're able to relax some of these criteria and be able to invest much earlier and take more risk. And I think that's basically the starting point to understand, with whom you are speaking or who you have in front of you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think what all the four panelists really managed is to give us a feeling that this is a realistic perspective. We're not speaking about the other side of the moon here. Private capital is there and can be invested. So my level of hope has been kind of refueled, so to say. But then there's always the question of the last mile. So we're not speaking about the other side of the moon, we're speaking about something close by, but how to get there. So please help me, especially Alan and Jakob now. Let's talk a little bit about the W's. Who, when, where? What do we need to do? What is the next step? How to really make something happen that brings private capital into the humanitarian sector? What would be your best advice? When, after this panel, I sit down with my colleagues, of whom some are here in the audience, and say, listen, now let's follow up on this panel. What should be the work plan for the next 3 months? Alan.
So I think I'll take the opportunity to give an example, easiest to understand how it works, because at the end of the day, it is about building relationships and crossing silos between sectors. And so the advisory model project that we are piloting is in Jordan with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. EBRD has structured a loan to the Jordanian government to deliver wastewater infrastructure to the community of West Irbid, which is a community home to Syrian refugees and members of the Jordanian host community. And EBRD always does an impact assessment of their investments. But given the more fragile context of this community, they sought out advice from the IRC on the impact and the community engagement around this investment. This will bring first-time sewerage to 18 towns. So the livelihood outcome is remarkable. But to get there, there's quite a long process of construction. People will be displaced from their homes, jobs will be lost, jobs will be created. And so what IRC is positioning itself as an advisor to EBRD is using its local context of working in Irbid for the past decade, knowing who the stakeholders are in the community, knowing who the people you need to call to get things done are in the community, and turning around and advising EBRD on how to ensure that those risks around this investment are better mitigated. And one of the first things that we've advised EBRD to do that they've followed through on our first deliverable really was to engage a local technical consultant, a Jordanian NGO, to do this community engagement work. And so embedded in our advisory is a commitment to localization and to capacity sharing, because IRC will be providing oversight on that community engagement work and working very closely with the local NGO to ensure that that process goes smoothly. And we're really there to help them fill gaps in the work that they are doing. And then to EBRD, turning around and saying, here's some of the risks that we see, and here's also some of the positive impacts that are being measured from our side about this investment. So I say all of that as a case study because a main component of this is really just building relationships and making sure that you're managing those relationships. And it can be, as Juan rightly said, this organizational readiness capacity is really critical, but it doesn't mean that IRC all of a sudden has to build an investment team. What we have to do is figure out what needs to happen between all of the stakeholders that are involved and start building those relationships. And so I would say it's both very big, but also very simple in crossing the line and working together. And I think my counterpart at EBRD would say the same thing. It's great working together. And yes, we have different systems, we have different processes, we have different ways of budgeting even. But some of that process work is what will be innovative, is seeing how we can come together and streamline processes together to drive more capital and to have the development sector really be off-takers for humanitarian agencies.
Thank you. Jakob, how does who, when, and where translate into Danish, especially Danish action?
Well, I think I'm very much this about, but I think one of the things I would focus on a little bit also, as humanitarian, we need to know our role. We need to know what our limitations are. We are not the ones who is going in and do the investment and finding out how to do things. We need to bridge the gaps between the ones who actually can bring the investment, can set up the structures, and bring the data in, and then pull something on the ground. Then maybe when we come to the action on the ground, then maybe we'll have a role there as well. But it doesn't necessarily have to be it, because I also think we need to think about new technology here, saying we can actually maybe circumvent all of us and go straight to the beneficiaries if we actually put these products together in the right way. So for me, I think one of the things that I really think is that we need to understand our role and make sure that when we do things, that we do not do it very, very for ourselves and only doing it for the Danish Red Cross or the IRC. And I think one of the things that we've been discussing very much with your team, Michael, is this about how do we ensure to build platforms that everyone can use? Because not all NGOs need to be able to understand how to set up these structures. What they need is platforms where they can do the work. So for instance, the cat bond that we have set up is based on a blockchain platform. And in general, everyone can access it. Everyone can use the structure if they just find the investments and the data to do it. I think the other thing that Ellen said, I think, is also really important is, and also what was mentioned from the private sector, is we need to be credible. And humanitarians, I'm sorry to say, even though we think we are very credible, we are not very credible in the investment divisions of the companies. So how do we create that credibility? Of course, we do it with our presence on the ground and all the things, but mainly what we also make sure is that the data that we come with the models we come with, needs to be validated by someone else. It should not be validated. Sorry, we are good in Danish Red Cross on data, but not that good that they can be validated. So you need third-party validation to make sure that data are sustainable. So again, you need to build that structure. And I think what I would very much, when you go back to your team, I think this very much promoting the linkage to make sure that it's very cross-sectional and not just for individual organizations. And the second thing I really want to encourage your team to do is also one of the things that I really think, you said it yourself, the government organization, you talk, but you talk to a lot of people. And if you can create the links between us and someone else, for instance, we had the pleasure of getting help to get to the European Investment Bank by your team. And I think for me, that is the help we need. We need to find the right people, and you have those talks.
Thank you, Jakob. Let's turn to Jean-Bertrand. I grew up in the conviction that private capital is shy. It is afraid of risk. But now this is about making private capital available for situations of fragility. That is what you're doing at AFD. What does it take to create the level of assurance that the private market needs in order to give you money for this kind of operation? What do we need to keep in mind in order to convince private capital to be invested in fragile situations and take the risk? Over to you.
Well, first, I think we have to convince them there's a real pocket of investment in these areas, because if you're not well versed in fragile and crisis context, you would say that it's a world big mess and that doesn't worth investing. Just to mention, for instance, that in the Sahel region, the growth rate of some of the countries was much higher than most of the European countries in the past few years, and that there is significant areas of fast-growing markets and investment opportunities in the Sahel. And it was, I think, well addressed during the last WEF edition. But I think for us, development bank, development actors, what we need to do is threefold. But I think Ellen mentioned it very well by saying it's about building relationship. But to go a bit further, what we should do is bring forward projects that have the potential to leverage private capital in order to show them that they could invest in these fragile settings. Then we have to create de-risking facility with a clear mandate and a range of mechanisms at scale to enhance support for most vulnerable communities. And that's a real challenge here, because most of our tools are based on grants, so we have to find better ways to circumvent grant issues. And then it was mentioned by Ellen too, we need to be better off-takers for investments in those areas. Again, I mentioned the RSTP tool we put in place. The best deal for investors is that we took the risk of at a rate of 80%. So we just have to systemize this kind of tools and find a better way to find them.
Thank you very much. And can I ask also Patrick, do we still need to convince the private sector that even fragile situations may be a good investment opportunity, or have they come to this conviction already themselves and just waiting for the right mechanisms right now? What does it take to make the match between the needs and the investment opportunities for private asset owners?
I mean, as it has been said, financial investors are very risk averse, and they feel uncomfortable as soon as their money is flowing into the global south or places they have not been or don't know. So I think there is certainly need, to educate them first of all about opportunities and give them the comfort, that there are investable companies and investable projects out there. And that's, again, as it has been said already, I think where partnership can play a very important role, because an investor would feel much more comfortable maybe in partnering with an NGO or a humanitarian organization that has a long-standing presence and expertise and networks in these places, and on which they can rely on. I don't think they would ever do that on their own without having any connections there. And then obviously, blended finance offers tremendous opportunities, to push these investors that are looking at making this kind of investments, but are still a bit reluctant. So they're starting somehow to flirt with the idea, but through blended finance, either by covering some of the preparation, upfront work, to identify the pipeline or doing the due diligence, or to de-risk some of the investments, or often many of these companies, they don't need only financing, but they also have non-financial needs, so they need technical assistance, which can be covered. I think there are many different mechanisms that have been tested and are being scaled. Also, I think, to be honest, there is lots of complexity in all of this. So it takes time. It takes time, and it's about building relationships where two parties can actually complement each other and make these things happen.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Two questions to actually all of you. Again, starting with Ellen, if you allow me. First, I think common sense has it probably that private money would not want to flood into any kind of humanitarian scenario. But there will be certain needs, certain scenarios where private money can probably be mobilized more easily than in others. So what would be perhaps your top 3 scenarios for which typically a private investor could be won? And what does it take really to basically get it done?
So the first is, as we've seen in our pilot project, infrastructure. So this is something that a lot of banks already do and do well. This is not a different vehicle or anything other than that. And I think there are a lot of banks that work in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, that already are comfortable taking risk in some of these places without a humanitarian agency. So I think it's about pushing the limits of what those banks are already doing, already investing in, and the infrastructure that they're already building. I mean, there's big hospital projects that are being built, and they're maybe not taking into account the humanitarian impact of that investment, and that's where we would want to come in and make sure that that's being measured and that's being accounted for. I think the other place that I would really see is in humanitarian supply chains, because humanitarian supply chains are these sort of abnormal market where they're not operating for profit, but you have some for-profit companies that are operating, providing goods and services to humanitarian programming. And so there's some market distortions that get created by that. And we think about healthcare, malnutrition treatment, education, all of those sort of fields where humanitarians work very, very diligently in programming. There's a parallel in sort of the innovation and tech side of the private sector, whether you're looking at venture capital, private equity, or just sort of broadly the private sector, where there's potential for dual use applicability of investments that are already being made to leverage technology or innovation in humanitarian programming, goods and services. And so what I always say is that the humanitarian sector is small, so you can't think of this as a driver of returns for any of these companies or for any of these investors, but a high tide rises all boats. If we can use the technology that's already being developed, then for humanitarian purposes, then we're closing a lot of the gaps that exist and we're linking across the sectors better. So I know you said 3, but I think those are the 2 main ones where we're seeing the most potential for immediate impact.
Thank you, Ellen. Could I also ask Patrick and Jean-Bertrand for your kind of hit list? And then I have a slightly different question to Jakob at the end, unless you want to continue. But the different question, which I already want to identify you to give you 2 minutes of reflection time, is, in your conviction, will this kind of, let me still call it innovative financing, will this always be kind of a byproduct in the humanitarian market? Or will it become significant? Will it become something that matches, for example, the classic way of financing, which are government grants? But first, maybe to Patrick and then Jean-Bertrand on your favorites for private sector investment in the humanitarian market.
Yes, thank you. Maybe again making a differentiation between the financial investor community and the more philanthropic investment community. The first one, I think the financial investment community, what they need or look for, when we speak with them, they like diversified portfolios. So they want to try to have some sort of diversification by enterprise, by countries, by region. That's the first thing. Second, there is a lot of interest for private debt kind of investment. So loans, private loans, with regular interest payments, and I think certainly some sort of de-risking gets immediate attention from this kind of investors. Now, when speaking with the more philanthropic-oriented investors, we have done quite a bit of work around impact-linked finance, which is a way where we actually can provide financing to enterprises and where the terms and conditions of the financing are linked to outcomes they realize, So you can agree with the enterprise specific outcomes to be reached over the years, KPIs, and if they're successful, they actually end up paying much less interest rate, up to 0 eventually. And I think it's a way where you can actually also influence and push certain companies to go to do some extra efforts, and it's very much aligned with the philanthropic type of investor.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Jean-Bertrand.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that Patrick just mentioned in his intervention before the fact that investors, they like securities, like bonds. So I would say that it would be a good driver for them a good investment driver to secure what I just mentioned at the beginning, this panel that we can work all together on a peace-building tool that would be a very efficient driver, I think, for investment in these countries. The other thing I wanted to mention was maybe the appeal to finance very local actors. That would be very interesting, I think, because quite concrete in terms of investment in SMEs that should be valorized and put at good use. That would be it.
Thank you very much. Jakob.
Yeah, I will actually try and answer both the questions at one point, but I just think that I truly hope so, that it will not just be a side show in the humanitarian world. I think we need to separate a little bit, because there is, at least we haven't found the right how to crack the nut on especially very conflict settings. It's very, very difficult right now, because you need some kind of multi-hazard models and so on, and that at least we haven't come to the point now that we can do credible models that can work in very conflict settings right now. So I think there will be some issues. There are other possibilities of investments in conflict settings, because of course there's a lot of lacks and access, which maybe the private sector can help. So I think there are other things. But when you look at the nature-based disasters and those areas, I think this should be a model that should be well integrated in the way we work. I cannot see why it should not be. There's so much potential, and that comes to the first question. There's so much potential in the loss and damage area. We're talking about Co-op 26 has the focus on loss and damage, and 27 will as well. And why not? We all know that the worst places where damage is after natural disasters and because of the climate is happening in the states where we're working. It's the humanitarian settings. So why not the humanitarian sector be very strongly involved in the loss and damage? I think it's such an obvious win for us to go there. And I think, at least from our side, that would be a main focus for the coming year, to make sure that we also look at the humanitarian side of these loss and damages.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Colleagues, you have all heard that the ambition of the European Commission is to have this European Humanitarian Forum once a year. So chances are that sometime in 9 to 12 months from now, we're going to meet again in Brussels, hopefully again with wonderful sunshine. We're going to have again a discussion on innovative financing. And I think the challenge we're facing there is not to repeat this discussion, but to state that we have moved forward in the right direction. And therefore, in the remaining 10 minutes that we have right now, let's perhaps focus not on the who, what, and where, but who does what now, concretely. And building on what you said, Jakob, already, can we define a little bit which player has which role here? The public sector, the intermediary institutions, the development banks, the commercial banks, the funds that there are. Who does what, and how do we construct something like an architecture that gets us going, that gets us into concrete action? And maybe we can hear Jean-Bertrand first on this, followed by Alan, Patrick, and then Jakob. Who does what? What is the role of each actor? And what does the public sector here, ECHO, in our case, need to do in order to help you with de-risking this kind of investment?
Well, that's a tough question to conclude, but I would speak for my side first, for a development bank. I think for the next 9 to 12 months, we have to work on solution to buy back the grant limitation we have for de-risking and being an off-taker for investment. So we really have to work on solution, and we could find, I think, good relays in development banks network that we've been building with IFDFC and Finance in Common summits we are having once a year, where development bank gathered and tried to put resources at once. I think that's a good start. Just trying to find the right tool and the right mechanism to scale up.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Over to you.
So I think we, as separate actors or separate stakeholders in the ecosystem, we need to be very clear about what our strengths are and what our weaknesses are, where partners can come in and either offtake or provide support. So humanitarian agencies, it's been said, but humanitarian agencies should not be structuring investments. They should not be sourcing investments. But what they can do is help close gaps around investments with access to information. context data around investments in more fragile contexts. And then from the development bank perspective, Jean-Bertrand said this, but it's a transaction sourcing role. So development banks should be looking for transactions that might be in contexts that they're not normally considering, knowing that there's the possibility of working with local humanitarian actors who would be able to help overcome some of that perceived risk. And then I think from the donor perspective, you have a tool that's actually really underutilized in the grant, because this is money that can't get returned, and investors love that. That doesn't exist in the investment world. You have to return the money with a return on top of it. And so how can we think more about having that grant capital be catalytic? And DG ECHO is doing this. I think the question is, how can you ensure that that is de-risking, creating more blended finance instruments, and also helping local SMEs, local actors get access to finance through either loan guarantees with local banks or otherwise, to ensure that that grant capital is being catalytic and not just sort of going out the door, but actually pulling in more capital from the private sector and the development sector.
Thank you, Ellen. Let's go back to Patrick, I think, before Jakob comes in. Jakob, your recommendations, please. Sorry, Patrick, of course, Patrick.
Yes, Michael, thank you. Allow me to say a few words about the Refugee Investment Fund we are launching with the Danish Refugee Council, because I think it illustrates perfectly, how the ecosystem plays. So we as iGravity, we are the investment manager, so we identify companies, we due diligence them, and we take them to the investment committee. We partner with the Danish Refugee Council, which obviously gives credibility to such an initiative, has a long-standing presence in humanitarian context, and knows the needs, the real needs and challenges of people of concern. So I think without them, this would not be possible. Then, the funding is coming on one hand from ECHO and other funders which are supporting this initiative early on, and allowed us to onboard also impact investors. So investors that are actually investing into this proposition, expecting to get some low return, but also bearing the full risk of this investment. So it's a wonderful combination of the two. And I think, in general, there will be lots of interest of working with accelerator, incubators, technical assistance providers that can help us generate more pipeline and allow the companies with whom we are speaking and looking at to become investment ready.
Thank you very much. And you were already mentioned.
No, but I think in general, I think we need to, I think what Ellen said is very well. I think this about providing the blended finance is really, really important, because we have a very big opportunity, and I think the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs did it quite well with the Danish organization, and it's probably why the Refugee Council has also been possible to do something with you, is that they are providing flexible funds that you can go out and talk to data providers and talk to structure investment firms that can structure the products for you and all the things. You need that kind of capital to do that. But when you're past that, as I said, the investment is very, very easy, generally easy to get, as long as you've got credible data. So I think the blended finance is really one area we need to work on. And then I think in 9-12 months, I think one of the challenges that we are facing, and we will be facing more generally if it gets into the mainstream, is also how to talk to the public sector and to the public population as well. Because in general, what you're trying to tell people now is that you will give things that are put aside for investors. You give money, people donate to the Danish Red Cross, then they expect the money to be sent to people who are in need. If we're then saying, oh, by the way, we can do it much smarter if we put it like this, but it will actually first go to investors. That is a challenge that we know that both you guys have had. This about how do our money be spent, and I think for us, we need at least internally to be able to take that head on and say, this is the best way, we think this is the right way, and I think we have a common communication challenge inside to make sure that happens. But I think in general, I can't see any way why we can't do that going forward. So I think for me, blended financing is the key to move this forward.
Thank you very much, Jakob. We have only 3 minutes and 13 seconds left. So just two very small final questions. One to Ellen, one to Jakob. Ellen, if I want to see best practice among donors, where do I need to go? Don't tell me Brussels. Which donor, in your view, is at this moment in time most advanced on mobilizing innovative financial solutions? The Irish, the Americans, the Saudis? Where would you go? Where should I, let's say, book my next flight to in order to learn more?
I feel like this is a trick question. I would say I am new to the humanitarian sector, and so I've only had the occasion to work with a few donors. But DG ECHO is supporting this project and has been tremendously supportive. Last year we were this time last year, to speak of progress in a year, it was just a concept, and that we presented at the Good Humanitarian Donorship Forum, and DG ECHO came out after that and said, this is something that potentially has some legs. You should keep innovating, keep thinking about it. And then the other support of us came from the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs at USAID, and they were the ones who helped with the design and supported the design, and are also trying some innovative things right now. We're working with them and a consortium led by the World Economic Forum, Gulf Investment Bank, Dahlberg, Cross Boundary, so a real mix of private sector, humanitarian, and development and donor to figure out how to bring investors and humanitarian actors together on investment disclosures in HRI context. Juan referenced this as well. So those are the two that I've had the pleasure of working with that have been tremendously supportive of being innovative. And I would say my recommendation to other donors is to allow for that failure that comes with innovation. And so being more willing to try things that may not work, but at the same time, when you're doing that, you're generating a tremendous amount of evidence.
Thank you, Ellen, for a very diplomatic answer. Jakob, let's imagine we mobilized really this private sector finance. When it then comes to scrutiny, to monitoring, would that be like just any other projects, or would it be more difficult to find out basically what the project is doing and to measure its level of success?
No, that's the short answer. I think in general what we see is the products that you do is the main work, and the main problem is the structuring and the whole setting up and the whole partnership. When it comes to, let's take our catastrophe bond on volcanoes, if a volcano explodes and the triggers will be met, in general what is needed then is humanitarian aid on the ground, and we then have leveraged a lot more fund. So the implementation as such is generally the same. So I don't see any challenge in there as such. I think the main challenge, or the thing that we should challenge ourselves, I said a little bit earlier, is can we make it even further? Can we push it so instead of it going to the Red Cross to try and help the people around the volcano, can we push it even further with new technology so it's actually the beneficiaries directly will get it and they can decide what to do with it, and they don't need us as an intermediate. That for me is also the fantastic thing. I know you were in the localization earlier, so I think for me that would be fantastic if we can go in that direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Ellen, to Jean-Bertrand, to Patrick, to Jakob, for basically waking us up during this hour of digestion after lunch, turning something which could be a very technical, dry discussion into something where I say, I have no more espoir, I have a lot of espérance, which means a certainty of hope. And actually from the ECHO side, I can promise you we're going to go further in order to underpin this hope. We have heard from some of you, Ellen was so kind, that ECHO is basically on the right track, but we don't want to be the only righteous ones. We want to be with the entire sector here. Yes, we are supporting IRC. Yes, we are supporting the Danish Refugee Council and iGravity in the pilot branded finance projects. But we also want to start, even this year, in partnering with international financial institutions, with AFD, with perhaps the World Bank, with others, with the European Investment Bank and so forth, in order to have a series of humanitarian-focused blended finance projects. And we want this over time to become the new normal and not just a nice thing to have. We need some pilots. We want to learn from the pilots. Not everything will be perfect, but it will hopefully pave the way for enriching our toolbox. And that is what the humanitarian sector needs. So thank you very much for leading us into this debate. Thank you very much for creating, I think, more enthusiasm for all the colleagues who are connected here or physically present in the room, that this is something which we should go, and this is something which may be contributing to solving not only our problems, but actually the problems of the people we are working for, the people who are in need, the people that we have a moral obligation to support. Thank you so much, and enjoy the next panel in the forum.